The fifth Monarchists and Thomas Venner's rebellion. We're at 2 o'clock now anyway. Venner's rebellion of 1661. As you can see from the date of this, 1661 takes us into the Restoration period, into the restored regime of Charles II. There are a number of debates among historians about precisely what was happening during the Restoration period, particularly whether Charles II's government was somehow reacting to previous events or whether there were any continuities with the past. So I think it's fair to say that before I actually dwell on the events of 1661, we need to actually take our minds back and provide some deep context about the period before, which they are largely reacting to. So I'm going to be talking for a paragraph or so about 1641 to 1660. Some of you may know this period as the English Civil Wars. I prefer to call it the English Revolution. Put my cards on the table anyway. In 1641, pre-publication censorship had effectively broken down, with the result that more than 33,000 printed titles were issued between about 1641 and 1660. Courts, which had facilitated the exercise of royal power, were abolished by Act of Parliament, notably the Star Chamber and High Commission. There was bloody rebellion in Ireland in 1641, and then devastating civil wars from 1642 throughout the British Isles. An estimated 80,000 soldiers were killed or maimed out of a population of probably no more than 5.3 million, a higher proportion of any point in English history thus far, and probably until the First World War. The Archbishop of Canterbury was executed, bishops deposed, and the Church of England stripped of its authority. For the first and only time in English history, a reigning monarch was put on trial, charged with treason, and publicly executed. Many more had, most of the royalists, a Commonwealth was declared and the House of Lords abolished. Most of the royalists who had supported Charles I were disarmed, some were imprisoned, and a few executed. Many more had to pay fines to keep hold of their homes and property. As for the Crown and the Church, much of their land was confiscated and sold off. The biggest beneficiaries were army officers on the winning parliamentarian side, who bought up large estates on the cheap. Meanwhile, some regiments began to mutiny over arrears of pay. But there were also the widows and orphans of slain combatants who had to beg to survive. So too did the wounded. Bad weather did not help. There was famine as harvests failed, animals died, and humans succumbed to plague. To paraphrase a couple of contemporary pamphleteers, one of whom will be familiar to you perhaps, the old world had been turned upside down and was burning up like parchment in the fire. Yet with the king defeated, the winners began arguing amongst themselves as to how the kingdom should be governed. Within this vacuum, new political movements and religious communities emerged. Among the best known are the Levellers, who demanded social justice and the introduction of religious toleration. The Diggers, who were essentially pacifists as well as communists. The Ranters, who their enemies said believed that individuals were free to do as they wished since sin had been abolished. And the Quakers, who were initially more transgressive and provocative than their modern counterparts. Many, or at least a great number, believed that the apocalypse was imminent and that Jesus Christ would come back to reign personally on earth rather than spiritually. Using a combination of the Bible and cutting-edge mathematics, they calculated the promised date of the apocalypse as 1650, and then 1656, and then 1666, and then, I'm not going to go into it, but then later on 1697. 1650 was based on the predictions of a Presbyterian called Thomas Brightman, most of whose works were published in Amsterdam. 1656, which is a fundamental date for us, is based on the idea that because the old world had been destroyed by water, the new world would be destroyed by fire. Christ was incarnated in the year 0. According to their calculations, based on the ages of the patriarchs, the flood of Noah had occurred 1656 years after creation, so the world's destruction by fire would be 656 years after incarnation. And 1666 is an easy one because that's just a millennium of 1,000 plus the number of the beast of 666. Don't ask me to explain 1697, that gets a bit hard. It's at this point, of course, that the fifth monarchists come in. Their name was taken from the book of Daniel. This is a biblical book, as you're all familiar with, I'm sure. Set, note the word set in ancient Babylon at the times of King Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, although most scholarship today thinks it was probably written much later, probably in the mid-2nd century before Christ. Sorry? Yeah? Yeah, good. I'm glad that's... need to check that. Parts of it relate to various dreams and visions concerning a statue made of different materials and 4 great beasts. Taken together, these 4 great beasts were usually interpreted as 4 world empires. And you can see on this illustration, I've got a pointer, but I'm not going to get up yet. You can see these, I probably will then. See, that's why I didn't want to get up. Assyria, Persia, Greece, Rome, standard interpretations. There's the sleeping king of Babylon having his dream, dreaming of the 4 great things, from a Dutch engraving of 1630. All 4 of these empires would be destroyed, after which there would be a 5th monarchy ruled by King Jesus, hence the fifth monarchists. Since they were not an organised religious community, like the Baptists or Quakers, it's difficult to date the precise beginnings of the fifth monarchists. But winter in 1651, shortly after Oliver Cromwell had defeated the enemies of the new republic in Ireland, Scotland and England, seems about right. Certainly by 1653, you can see there on the pamphlet on the right, the press was full of accounts about fifth monarchists meeting at several London locations. Thereafter, the movement spread, particularly in southern England. Outside the capital, support was concentrated in Suffolk, Norfolk, Devon, Cornwall and North Wales. Yet even allowing for exaggerated reports, of which there are many, at the height of their popularity, there were probably less than 10,000 fifth monarchists out of a population of about 5.2, 5.3 million. By comparison, there were perhaps as many as 25,000 Baptists and the most numerous of all, 60,000 Quakers. Besides the cry, "No king but Jesus," fifth monarchists were also interested in Jewish law. The most extreme adopted Jewish rituals and customs, including dietary regulations, circumcision for males, and celebrating the Sabbath on Saturday Sabbatarianism. Among the mainstream, there were demands for the revival of a Sanhedrin, an ancient Jewish law court, which was seriously considered as the model for parliamentary government in 1653. It's also worth mentioning, given their interest in Jews, that in 1656, the promised date of the apocalypse, Jews were tacitly readmitted to England. They'd been expelled in 1290, and Cromwell had overcome widespread opposition so as to turn a blind eye to their presence. Potential economic benefits were a factor, but more important was hastening the coming of King Jesus by creating a first-hand opportunity to convert Jews to Protestantism. Beforehand, however, Antichrist had to be defeated and the world destroyed by fire. To speed things along, and in a foreshadowing of the Great Fire of 1666, the followers of one-time Puritan claiming to be the high priest of the Jews deliberately burned a number of buildings in London around Fleet Street, causing thousands of pounds of damage. Then, in April 1657, and here there's a contemporary newspaper account, or newsbook as it's called, from the Public Intelligencer, there was a minor rising against Cromwell's protectorate. It was instigated by a fifth monarchist faction, so this is the first of the fifth monarchist risings, who regarded Cromwell as little better than an uncrowned dictator propped up by an unsteady alliance of local magistrates, obedient ministers and large sections of the army. In modern language, this is a rising against the revolution betrayed. Amongst the fifth monarchist plotters was Thomas Venner, a cooper, possibly originally from Devon, with artillery training, who had spent time in Massachusetts. The rebel standard was a fiery flag, a red lion resting on a white background bearing the motto, "Who shall rouse him up?" And if you go on the internet, you'll find that modern day fifth monarchists have actually redesigned the flag and have marched on Westminster. The rebellion, however, it has to be said, was a complete shambles. Thanks to well-organised government surveillance, it was swiftly crushed with no recorded loss of life. Venner was imprisoned without trial, a hallmark of the Cromwellian regime. Look, for example, at what happened. Actually, no. But certainly not released, and kept in the Tower of London, where he remained until at least the 28th of February 1659. Oliver Cromwell himself died on the 3rd of October 1658, the anniversary of his two great military victories at Dunbar and Worcester. He was the man who had held it all together, and within 9 months the protectorate of his son and successor Richard had unexpectedly collapsed. The restored Rump Parliament, which replaced him, fared little better, lasting less than a year. On the 25th of April 1660, a new Parliament assembled. Known as the Convention Parliament, it consisted of both a House of Commons and a re-established House of Lords. A month later, on the 25th of May 1660, Charles II returned from exile, landing at Dover. On his 30th birthday, a few days later, he entered London in procession. Immediately, this merry monarch set about securing his power base. Potentially disloyal army regiments were disbanded, the militia resettled, and a royal bodyguard created. A new administration was formed. Although important posts were granted as rewards to royalist supporters during the Protectorate, it's worth bearing in mind that Charles's government nonetheless featured some former Cromwellians who shrewdly swapped sides at the last moment. Royalists were also put in charge of local government and key urban areas. With his enemies purged, the king decided against a bloodbath. Instead, he pursued a policy of reconciliation to heal his wounded kingdoms. Those implicated in his father's trial and execution, however, were shown little mercy. 10 regicides, the people who'd signed the death warrant of Charles I, including the fifth monarchist Thomas Harrison, were publicly hung, drawn and quartered in October 1660. As you can see there, for example, in an anti-regicide pamphlet. Others were imprisoned or fled abroad, and in one case, rather like a modern spy novel, was captured, put back in a boat and taken to England. On the 30th of January 1661, the 12th anniversary of Charles I's execution, Cromwell's body was exhumed and posthumously beheaded, together with that of his son-in-law and 2 other hated regicides. The heads were put on the gates. Cromwell's remained there for over 20 years till it blew off in a gale. If you want to know where it is now, it's somewhere in the grounds of Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, his college at Cambridge, but only the bursar knows the apparent location. There you can see a traitor's head. Despite deep divisions, quite a few opponents of the Restoration regime united against a common enemy under the banner of the good old cause. And this is important. Everything is interpreted providentially. They interpreted their devastating defeat as God's harsh judgment against their failings. To quote one contemporary, "The Lord has blasted them and spit in their faces." Even so, they regarded this terrible change in their fortunes, the restoration of the Stuart monarchy, as but a temporary setback before God granted them ultimate victory. Disaffected Cromwellian army officers, alienated republicans, disgruntled nonconformist preachers, and discontented printers therefore began to form clandestine alliances. The results ranged from ill-fated plots and insurrections to the secret publication of incendiary pamphlets, including collections of prophecies, portents and natural disasters interpreted as signs of the Stuart monarchy's impending destruction. Although fearful of this radical underground, the government infiltrated it highly successfully with an effective network of spies and agents provocateurs. Enemies of the state were flung into prisons where many died and many more were debilitated because of the noxious conditions. This brings me to Thomas Venner's second attempt at rebellion in London. This is the best view I could get of London before the Great Fire, because it's a very different city, obviously, after 1666. You'll notice what tells you it's pre-Great Fire. I'm going to be careful this time. This is the benefit of experience. Is St. Paul's Cathedral here. This is the old St. Paul's where the spire has dropped off. in the Elizabethan period. What I'll do is I'll describe the rebellion and then I'll take you through the map of where it actually happened. So these are all pre-London, pre-fire. So on Sunday the 6th of January 1661, Thomas Venner raised the second rebellion. Pamphlets, newspapers, letters, diaries, memoirs, chronicles and court records enable us, or at least me, to partially reconstruct events. Setting out from their meeting house in Swan Alley in Coleman Street, which is over here. I've decided not to use the pointer. After all, my little finger will do. Simon went to the trouble of getting a pointer, but now I'm going to stand on it. Over here, that old Nessus edition, about 50 heavily armed Fifth Monarchists marched on St. Paul's Cathedral, where they demanded the keys from a bookseller. There they shot a man who declared for King Charles rather than King Jesus. Unfortunate allegiance. With the alarm raised, the city guard sent musketeers against them, but they were put to flight. London's mayor then led a troop of reinforcements. Outnumbered, the bulk of the Fifth Monarchists retreated towards Aldersgate, which is up in this way. And after killing a constable, they withdrew to Kenwood, which is situated between Highgate and Hampstead, so well outside the boundaries of this map, but you know where I am, North London. And then the serious rising. On the morning of Wednesday, the 9th of January, weakened by hunger, they entered London again. Once in the city, the Fifth Monarchists seemed to split in different groups, or else were reinforced by a contingent coming from London Bridge. From contemporary sources, we can work out that one party is coming up here through London Bridge, and most of them enter from Stepney through Bishopsgate. I've also found court records which indicate that some houses had caches of arms dumps ready for the rising, which if they could take certain key strategic locations, they'd get additional weaponry and armoury. Venner's party intended to capture the mayor and his bed over here, but were attacked by a company of trained bands in a fierce engagement in Cheapside around here. They then withdrew into Wood Street, which is over here, where there was a prison, and they held it for about 15 minutes, fighting violent skirmishes all the time. The idea was to go into Wood Street Compter to release the prisoners, think of the French Revolution and the Bastille, possibly to get more soldiers to take part in the rebellion. During this skirmish, Venner is said to have wielded a halberd, there he is there, with his halberd, in which he supposedly killed 3 men, quite probably he did. They were then fired upon, so in this area here, by troops led by a Major or Lieutenant Colonel Cox. Venner was seriously wounded and at this point appears to have been captured. The survivors fled and dispersed. One group certainly escaped from Paul's Cathedral up here, here's London Wall, and then tried to get out of the gate around here. There's a postern gate in the wall, but it was locked. So they went into a nearby alehouse called the Blue Anchor near Cripplegate, which proved to be their demise. Between 7 and 10 holed up in the upper room in the Blue Anchor. Cox, the lieutenant who chased them, got hold of the adjoining house, climbed it, threw off the tiles, and got his men to shoot down into the windows at the same time, simultaneously storming the house from the front. They killed 5 or 6 Fifth Monarchists and the survivors surrendered. A few may have escaped in this direction because there's reports of fighting over here again in a different pub called the Helmet. These Fifth Monarchists withstood 2 volleys of musket fires and 2 charges, where they finally routed and took casualties. Altogether, of the 50 or so, maybe 60 Fifth Monarchists involved, there are about 30 survivors of Venner's Rising. 25, including 7 wounded, were captured and imprisoned in Newgate. In fact, we have their names from a court record on the right-hand side there. You can just about see, if you've got very good eyes, Thomas Venner is the very first name on the list of the captives of the court records. 4 at least escaped, possibly more. According to the diarist Samuel Pepys, their battle cry had been the King Jesus and the regicides' heads upon the gate. And to clarify, in retribution for the death of the regicides. At their trial at the Old Bailey, 16 were found guilty and 4 acquitted. On Saturday, the 19th of January 1661, Venner and another ringleader were drawn upon a sledge, which was the customary mode of transport for convicted people about to face capital punishment, from Newgate to Coleman Street. At the gallows erected outside their meeting house, Venner proclaimed that what I did was according to the best light I had and according to the best understanding that Scripture will afford. Refusing to confess, he insisted that all the doctrines he had preached were the truth. Together with his companion, a button seller by trade, Venner was hung, drawn and quartered. Within days, 11 more Fifth Monarchists were hung and beheaded. The heads were set on London Bridge and their dismembered bodies put on 4 of the city's gates, because they're cut into quarters, so they couldn't do more than 4, obviously. King Jesus had not come. Now, I don't have time, obviously, to talk about the major print sensation that the riot led to, and I know Aidan is going to be discussing one of the works, but there's a major propaganda campaign as a consequence against the Fifth Monarchists. You'll note from the dates in the bottom left-hand corner, when the books are acquired, that most of these are acquired in January 1661, so within days of the rising, all hostile to the Fifth Monarchists. They contain purported last words and testaments of the Fifth Monarchists, because last dying words were considered often to have prophetic import. Interestingly, especially given one of the things that's been mentioned in this conference, contemporaries didn't hesitate to draw a parallel between the Fifth Monarchist rising and the Anabaptists of Munster, quite explicitly there in Munster paralleled. So there's John of Leyden, Munster paralleled, quite obvious delegitimisation campaign. In a chronicle history published within 2 years, Venner is shown in all his monstrous, hideous, militaristic form here. And then subsequently in German publications, such as this one and this one, which conflates both the Fifth Monarchists and the nakedness of Quakers, come Adamites, which obviously is not accurate. Interestingly, I don't have very good 17th century German, so if anybody does, there's a pamphlet in German. This is the image from it, which purports to depict the actual execution of Venner and his followers. It can't be right because, as I said, they're executed outside their meeting house, which is subsequently demolished. But it purports to draw a narrative in which Venner is hung, drawn and quartered. And if you can't see, can you see that now? So Thomas Venner actually being split open, and then you've got the dismembered body parts and the hanging. So what they do is they would hang them, then they would drag the body around on the horses, the drawn bit, and then they would quarter them. One consequence was that there are a number of plots that continue against Charles II. The Tong plot, the Yorkshire Rising, the Popish plot, the Exclusion Crisis, the Rye House plot. Plots remain a part of Charles II's reign. And more interesting is the delegitimisation of all nonconformists, whether Fifth Monarchists or not, notably, for example, the Quakers. And as one immediate consequence is the embrace by Quakers of the so-called peace testimony, the idea that from henceforth they are pacifists in modern language. They are not at all like the Fifth Monarchists. 2 minutes or?
We're just about out of time.
Yes, 2 minutes. Just to. So really, I need to conclude and think, what are the big lessons here? How does millenarianism relate to violence? Obviously, as I hope I've shown, it comes down first of all to context, and secondly to interpretation. You've got one bunch of millenarians who are using violence in the shape of certain Fifth Monarchists. You've got Quakers who are renouncing violence, even though some of them had accepted it. And I might want to throw in the Diggers, who also embraced non-resistance as another trajectory. So apocalypticism does not have to lead to violence, is my first point, although it can. But my second point, when I was thinking about on the way in, was that a number of people involved in Venner's rebellion had actually been former soldiers in the parliamentarian armies. Now, if we consider the composition of the parliamentarian army as containing a lot of soldiers who believe themselves to be God's instruments on earth, providentially winning victories, engaged obviously in violence as conflict, then it seems that a core residue of those people who have got military training, military experience, and the vindication of having won victories in the fighting for God, continuing that violence into Venner's rebellion. So, how widespread was violence within millenarianism in this period? In the case of actual millenarian risings, obviously not very. But in the case of millenarians who had engaged in violent activities, well, once you begin to arrange that into Parliament's armies during the Civil War, it becomes a much wider spectrum. So not necessarily an outcome, but certainly a possibility. And that's where I think I'll conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel. Thank you very much. Questions for Ariel at all? Christopher?
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Just two questions. All that stuff about calculating the end of the world, I mean, how common is that in fifth monarchist literature?
Well, they have the dates already calculated for them. So.
I mean, it's just that in the stuff that I've read, I haven't come across all that much of it.
That's what I'm saying. There's not much calculation because they believe it's already imminent.
Yeah.
So
there's a difference between imminence and actually saying calculate is going to come in 1651 or 1653.
Yeah, and they're more concerned about actually what theocracy will replace government. Yeah.
I mean, the other thing is, if I can just kind of get hold of this, is just thinking of Stuart Wright's emphasis on external factors as important for violence. I wonder what you make of the interpretation of Mary Carey, who's a fifth monarchist, who interpreted the rider on the white horse in the book of Revelation, leading the army in the struggle as including human beings, and that included the saints. Now, I'd always assumed that she'd worked that out herself on the basis of just her interpretation. It wasn't an external factor at all. So, and it's a kind of a contrary kind of element to what Stuart Wright might have been saying, that it wasn't an external factor. This was actually the result of interpretation solely. I mean, what do you make of that?
Again, I mean, I think I'd agree with your point again, that it seems to be, if it's not interpretation solely from her, then that would be because of the congregation she's been attending and the preaching that she's been exposed to. But the idea of people, autodidacticism is very prevalent in this period. People engaging with the text and interpreting it themselves, very common, and I think it's highly plausible that she could come up with this. You can contextualise it further and say, look at Anna Trapnell's prophecies, which she's having them. Okay, they're being shaped by male editors and male amanuenses, but she's still having these prophecies quite clearly, that you've got to allow for individual ability to do that. And on the date thing, it's interesting that this is published in 53, in the year that the Cromwell calls the so-called bare-bones parliament, and the first and only time in English history where a parliament is elected by churches and not by people. So they thought the door was, they may not know the exact year, but they thought the door was being opened. Yeah.
Question back here first, Susan, then we'll just have time for...
I was wondering if Thomas Venner and his followers, did they accept the idea of a divine right of the king? So would they be more favourably disposed towards Charles I than Oliver Cromwell?
They rejected no king but Jesus. The only king who had a divine right to rule was Jesus.
Well, this follows up, perhaps my eyesight's wrong, but I thought on one of the woodcuts of Venner you had King Venner.
Which one?
I think it's the first one you've got
that
of
with the
Venner.
This
now
one?
down at the bottom, does that not say King Venner?
Yes, in ironic. Yeah, this helmet was a crown by revelation. This halberd was a sceptre for the nation. So the fifth monarchy in you is graced by King Venner next to John o' Leyden placed. So it's an ironic attack. But absolutely right to bring it up. That it's a form of ridiculing that. Here's King Jesus.
Just time for one more question if we have one, a quick one. Anybody? Yes, back there. Joe.
Thanks, Ariel. That was really interesting. I have a bit of a selfish question, which is, can you tell us very briefly a little bit about the contemporary Fifth Monarchists that you mentioned? They changed the flag, they'd done some marching. There was just a very brief comment that you made in the paper, and I wanted to know more.
Do we have web access on this?
I don't know if we've got internet, maybe.
We don't. Oh well.
What's going on there? That's fascinating.
I don't think it's religious. I think it's political. They definitely. I think one of them's an anarchist called. I don't want to. I was going to say Ian Bone, but I thought isn't that the name of a Tory MP? But but I was going to say Ian Bone, isn't it? Yeah, Ian Bone. Class war. Yeah, class war. Thank you. Yeah, so it's much more like modern day class war. And they. No, but I'm saying I'm not making it up. You've seen the you've seen the stuff. Yeah, so they've gone around with this, and they've got the little kids there, and some of them are dressed up in uniform and the 17th century dress, and we've got Civil War enactors and sealed knots and things like that. Why can't we have Fifth Monarchist reenactors?
Okay, thank you, Ariel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.